Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a topic today that for a lot of people instantly brings up these images of, smoke-filled rooms, shady deals, maybe even a full-blown political scandal. We're talking about off-budget structures.
And that reaction is completely understandable, but that immediate jump to conspiracy or misconduct, that's precisely the narrative we need to sort of set aside for this deep dive.
Right.
Our sources really challenge that assumption.
Yeah.
We're explicitly not here to talk about who's to blame or, who's pocketing what.
So if we strip away all of that emotional weight, all the political noise, what's left? What's the structural core of what's going on here?
What's left is actually a really profound insight into how governments work. The central idea we're pulling from this material is that off-budget structures, they aren't some kind of exception to the rules of democratic government.
Okay.
It's quite the opposite. They are a historical, almost predictable result of, well, rational governance just trying to function under immense pressure.
Yeah, that is a total reframing. So you're saying the system, in its attempt to be accountable and deliberate and controlled, becomes so rigid that it structurally has to invent its own escape routes.
Exactly. They emerge because institutions were trying to follow the rules, but the rules were just too slow or too inflexible for the reality they were facing.
So our mission for you, listener, is to understand this process of what you call structural drift.
Structural drift, it's about how these systems just accumulate complexity and opacity over time. This isn't about finding a villain. It's about understanding the function these things fill and why they stick around, even in the most transparent democracies.
All right, so before we get into that big why, let's just establish the ground rules. When we use the term off-budget in this deep dive, what exactly are we talking about? Give us the analytical definition.
Sure. So we're defining it very strictly. It's any activities, spending, or commitments that operate outside the regular legislatively approved annual budget process.
So it bypasses the main high-visibility government ledger?
The key is it bypasses that primary ledger and, just as important, the strict timeline that goes with it.
And the distinction between off-budget and just plain illegal is obviously crucial here.
Oh, absolutely critical. The sources we've looked at stress 3 points. First, these mechanisms are almost always legal. They're formally authorized, often by a specific law that gives them a mandate.
So they're created in the open at first.
Yes. And second, they're almost always kicked off as an exceptional or, a temporary measure. Nobody creates one of these things planning for it to last for 50 years.
And the third point, the one that makes people a bit uncomfortable.
That would be the defining characteristic, reduced visibility. Because they operate outside that single comprehensive budget document, they can't help but lead to fragmented accountability.
Meaning no one has the full picture.
Exactly. No single document or committee captures the whole commitment. They aren't illegal, they're just scattered. And that makes them really hard to track in one systemic view.
That clarity helps a lot. So if the official budget process is designed for maximum oversight, for transparency, for deliberation, why would a rational government ever willingly move critical functions outside of it?
It comes down to a fundamental conflict that our sources all point to. You can call it the timescale mismatch.
Okay.
It's speed versus procedure.
Explain that mismatch. Give us the practical timeline.
Well, democratic budgeting as a process is designed to be deliberate. It works on a timescale of years. You have committee meetings, public debates, legislative approval, annual reviews.
All the checks and balances we learn about.
Right. And those are virtues. They're necessary for consensus-driven governance.
Yeah.
But those very virtues become serious liabilities in a crisis.
Because a crisis doesn't wait for the annual review cycle.
A crisis, a sudden war, a market panic, a disaster demands immediate speed. The mismatch is that the democratic process is built for a one-year cycle. But a crisis needs a response in days, maybe even hours.
So the government has a choice. Stick to the slow, proper process and risk total collapse. Or create a workaround that bypasses all that oversight.
That is the hard choice. And off-budget mechanisms emerge not as an abuse of power, but as a rational response to that urgency. They are, in a sense, a compensation for democracy's temporal limits.
A structural pressure valve.
Exactly. If a decision, let's say to prop up a failing financial sector, can't wait for a 2-year legislative process, it has to be handled outside of that time frame.
Let's make that more concrete. Talk about financial stabilization. Why is that mismatch basically unavoidable in that kind of situation?
Okay, take the classic example of a central bank trying to stop a sudden market meltdown. If a major bank is, say, hours away from failure, that failure risks a domino effect.
Contagious.
Systemic contagion, yes. It could crash the entire economy. Legislators cannot debate, draft, vote on, and allocate a multi-billion-dollar rescue package in 48 hours. It is procedurally impossible.
While the market itself is panicking on a scale of minutes.
Precisely. To stop the bleeding, you need to inject liquidity immediately, issue guarantees, maybe even support an institution overnight. The existing slow budget structure just isn't fit for that purpose.
Yeah, you have to create a special vehicle.
You have to. The government or the central bank creates a special purpose off-budget vehicle that can act at the speed of the crisis. It's really an unavoidable necessity.
Okay, so that establishes the rational starting point. A temporary exception born out of panic. But we know these things rarely stay temporary. How does that exception, that thing created for the perfect storm, become a permanent part of the landscape? Where does the drift begin?
This is where institutional inertia just takes over, and it happens in a surprisingly simple way. A crisis triggers the original temporary exception.
Right.
But then maybe 3 years later, a similar, maybe smaller, but related long-term issue comes up.
And since that emergency tool is already authorized, funded, and people know how to use it,
It becomes so much easier structurally and politically to just reuse the existing exception than it is to start the whole slow official budget process from scratch. Precedent makes it faster.
so it's not a conspiracy, it's just convenience, the path of least resistance.
It's the path of least resistance. You expand the tool you already have rather than building a new, fully visible one.
So this expansion it's unintentional growth. It's driven by convenience, not some grand plan for secrecy.
That's it. And then trying to reverse these things becomes politically costly. Once a dedicated fund is handling, say, critical infrastructure or pension liabilities, getting rid of it means you have to drag all those difficult issues back into the high-friction, very public annual budget debate.
And nobody wants that fight.
It's just simpler to leave the mechanism in place, even long after the original crisis is over. It happens not because of a villain, but because of pure expediency.
And as more and more of these expedient structures pile up, how does that oversight problem, the lack of visibility, get worse? You mentioned fragmentation.
Fragmentation is the cumulative effect. Imagine trying to figure out your total national debt, but instead of one central ledger, you have to look in 50 different departmental filing cabinets that aren't linked up.
Okay, I see.
When you have dozens of these separate funds and vehicles, each with its own reporting rules overseen by a different committee, no single entity, not the Treasury, not Parliament, not the public, has a complete systemic view of the country's total commitments.
So it's the structural complexity that makes the system opaque, even if every individual piece is technically public somewhere.
That is the key distinction. The information might exist somewhere, but the ability to put it all together, to synthesize it, and hold the government accountable for the total commitment, that gets lost. That's the real danger of structural drift.
This leads us right to this really critical contradiction from our sources, which is the transparency paradox.
Yeah.
We all assume that more transparency is the cure for opacity.
Yeah.
But does pushing for it actually help solve this problem?
It's so counterintuitive, isn't it? But the structural analysis suggests that often, no, it doesn't solve the underlying existence of these things.
Right.
The paradox is that the more transparent and rigorous your formal budget systems become, the more rules and scrutiny you apply, the stronger the incentives become to operate outside of them.
Wait, so making the system more strict actually creates a bigger demand to escape it. Why?
Because more transparency means more procedural friction. And critically, it means more political vulnerability. Every decision takes longer. Political opponents can pick apart every single number, and every line item becomes a political battleground.
The system gets bogged down.
It gets so overloaded that it becomes almost unworkable for anything that's complex or time-sensitive or just politically difficult.
So people inside the government, the ones trying to get something necessary done, they're then forced to find a workaround, an explanation-exempt area to just maintain some operational capability.
Exactly. They have to create an area that's shielded from that intense political friction. And they use these very familiar justifications. They'll say, this case is exceptional. It can't survive 2 years of public debate.
Oh.
Or the subject is just too complex for the public to really grasp the nuance. Or the classic one, there are security reasons why we can't debate this openly right now.
So the off-budget mechanism isn't really born from a desire for secrecy for its own sake. It's a reaction to the main system being too slow and visible to handle a complex reality.
That's the core structural insight. It's a side effect. It's an attempt to preserve functionality within a system that's struggling under the weight of its own procedural friction.
So what does this all mean for us? I mean, if these structures are a predictable, even rational result of how democracies handle speed and crisis,
Yeah.
can they ever really be eliminated?
No. The analysis is pretty clear on this. They can't be eliminated entirely because they compensate for those essential temporal limits in a democracy.
The timescale mismatch.
As long as you have the democratic need for slow, careful deliberation on one hand, and the government's need for instant action in a crisis on the other, you're going to have mechanisms to bridge that gap. The goal here is structural tracing, not moral judgment.
So the problem isn't that these structures exist, it's the side effects. It's the unchecked growth and the opacity that comes with it.
Precisely. The central issue isn't their existence. It's the accumulation, the opacity, and eventually the complete loss of a systemic overview as these structures drift further and further from their original temporary purpose. We need to focus on tracing how that rational exception becomes the routine.
That reframing really helps us look forward. Because if off-budget mechanisms are fundamentally an adaptation to the speed limit of human politics, then any technology that changes that speed is going to have a massive impact.
It raises a really profound question about the future of governance, and it's one that should give you pause. Well, if AI and algorithmic systems continue to accelerate technical and financial decision-making, it just widens that gap between technical speed and democratic speed even further. Will that force an expansion of off-budget governance? Or will those same powerful tools finally give us a way to cut through all that fragmentation and make these invisible structures totally visible for the very first time?
That is the open question.